Bonsoir and good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine Spencer-Ross and I'm President of Heritage Ottawa and Chair of its Lecture Series Committee. Welcome to this evening's Heritage Ottawa Lecture, which for the first time is being presented remotely from Toronto, where both our speaker and I are attending a conference. You'll be glad to know the team in Ottawa will keep us on track. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa, where Heritage Ottawa focuses its work, is at the heart of a vast homeland whose history reaches back long before the development of the National Capital Region as we now know it. For hundreds of years, Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples have been pressing for their Indigenous rights to be respected and their history to be understood. Heritage Ottawa makes efforts through our programs and partnerships to bring awareness to Algonquin history and heritage with events and programming. Our free lecture series is made possible with the generous support of our leadership sponsor, Sandy Smallwood and Andrex Holdings, and of Merkley Supply Limited. We're also grateful for grants from the City of Ottawa and the Province of Ontario. I'd also like to thank those of you who are members and those of you who have made donations to Heritage Ottawa. Your support is vital to our sustainability as an organization and allows us to present programming such as this free lecture. If you are a non-member, I invite you to join the organization, and I encourage you all to consider making a financial contribution to Heritage Ottawa at any time, and particularly on the upcoming Giving Tuesday on December 2nd. Please visit our website at heritageottawa.org for details. Turning to this evening's presentation, I'm very pleased that Heritage Ottawa is hosting this lecture about Thomas Seaton Scott and his extensive works here in Ottawa and elsewhere. At the end of this evening's presentation, we will have a Q&A session, which will be moderated by Heritage Ottawa board member Paul Bennett. Thank you, Paul, for taking on this role. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. David Jeans is well known to many of our members. He's a fixture of Heritage Ottawa, having been a board member for more than 20 years, 4 of which were as president. He has guided walking tours, presented lectures, developed and led coach tours, written articles, and been an ardent advocate for our built heritage. Above all, we rely on David for his extensive knowledge of Ottawa architects and buildings, and for details of our procedures and bylaws. David has been interested in architecture since the age of 7 when he grew up around classical, Jacobean, and Gothic buildings in England. He is a retired professional engineer who pursued a career in data communications in Ottawa. He has published articles on railway history, heritage architecture, and genealogy. In addition to his work with Heritage Ottawa, since his retirement, David has worked with Doors Open and has been president of the advocacy organization Transport Action. He is involved with many railway, historical, and genealogical societies. David has spoken before about Thomas Seaton Scott, but he has continued to research Scott's background and his projects, and he will be sharing these new findings with us this evening. After his presentation, David has agreed to take a few of your questions. It is now a great pleasure to turn the floor over to David.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So, to share my screen here, and hopefully you can see that. Thomas Seaton Scott was the first chief architect of Canada at the Department of Public Works. His work included railway stations, churches, government buildings, and much else. He was born in 1826 in Birkenhead, England, and died in 1895 in Ottawa. So the basic facts. But you know many of his buildings in Ottawa: the Drill Hall, top left, St. Bartholomew's Church below, the Mackenzie Tower of the West Block of Parliament in the center. Perhaps you know 478 Albert Street, which was his home, formerly the Albert House Inn, and buildings on Parliament Hill. Scott was born in Birkenhead in 1826. His parents came from Liverpool, just across the River Mersey, and he apprenticed in the 1840s to his older brother, the architect Walter Scott, in the village of Bebbington, which was halfway between Birkenhead and Chester. So he probably qualified as an architect at age 21, in 1847, and at this date, railways were just coming to the area around Birkenhead, Chester, and North Wales. In fact, one of the largest railway stations in early Victorian England was built at Chester General Station in 1848, designed by the architect Francis Thompson, who I'll talk about later. After qualifying as an architect, Scott went on the grand tour of Europe, particularly Italy and Germany, and I was able to trace a good part of his itinerary through the records that he kept. He visited cities from Gubbio, Rimini, Padua, Venice, Vicenza, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, Milan, and Torino, and you can see the circles along the route that he followed, and I also have approximate dates. He then continued down the Rhine from Strasbourg all the way to Cologne, visiting a number of cities, and both in Italy and in Germany, he was sketching important landmarks everywhere he went, and I've listed some of them here, which are represented either by drawings or watercolors in his sketchbooks. The sketchbooks, I don't know exactly how many, but I went through sketchbook number 6 at Library and Archives Canada. They don't have the complete set, but that sketchbook alone has 781 indexed architectural sketches or watercolors. He dated it June 1st, 1850, when he was in Padua. The missing books may cover other cities earlier or later in his 7-month-plus tour, for example, Rome and other buildings in Cologne. One of the last Italian cities he visited, Turin, introduced him to this round arch Romanesque style, which became very important in Germany, where it was called Rundbogenstil, and in England, where it was called the railway style and was used for many railway stations. Although the piazza in Turin has changed since he did his sketches, the buildings that are there today are still fairly similar to the sketch that he did. And this round arch architecture was inspired by the Pitti Palace in Florence, and as I said, influenced both German and British architects. In Germany, among the places that he drew buildings was Speyer, where the Altportal is reputed to be the finest Gothic gate tower in Germany. And you can see his sketch on the left is very, very similar to the modern day picture of that same tower on the right. I'm going to go back 2 drawings because his sketch of St. Zeno's Church in Verona is also extremely similar to the appearance of that same church today. And given the hundreds of drawings that he was doing, it's amazing that he was able to capture that architectural detail so well and so quickly. But he didn't just draw buildings, he drew architectural details, tracery, ornamentation, finials, staircases, balustrades, arches, and every single one of these sketches was numbered and cataloged so that he could refer through the index if he wanted to see a selection of staircases or a selection of arches or brackets. He could find them quickly. So I think these sketchbooks were intended to be his pattern book for his future architectural work. Now, back in Britain, I'll introduce 4 men who were very important to Scott's career: Samuel Morton Peto, Thomas Brassey, Edward Ladd Betts, and William Jackson got the contract to build the Grand Trunk Railway of Canada from Montreal to Toronto in 1852. And Thomas Brassey, who was also from Birkenhead, built a large factory there called Canada Works to manufacture all the ironwork for the Canadian Railway, locomotives, cars, rails, bridge components. Many local Birkenhead people were hired, about 1,600 of them to work at Canada Works, and many more to go to Canada to work on the construction of the railway. Canada Works was just outside the centre of Birkenhead, on an inlet from the River Mersey. The black drawings there were the buildings, including a huge iron foundry with 600 iron workers in that one building. And they built their own purpose-built ship to transport the railway components to Canada. Canada Works is gone today, but there's a historic plaque there commemorating the works and Thomas Brassey, who was the greatest of the early Victorian railway contractors. The arrow at the bottom right pointing to Birkenhead shows the road leading to the Scott family home, which was about a mile from Canada Works. As I mentioned, Scott apprenticed to his brother Walter, who was a very successful architect, both in Cheshire and in Somerset. And he and Thomas partnered for a few years after Thomas's European tour and designed houses and mansions, particularly in the affluent suburb of Claughton. Scott later built his own house, this one, in Claughton, so that you can see that he was had prospered in his architectural career. And one of his neighbors was, in fact, William Jackson, who had founded that consortium to build the Grand Trunk Railway, and he lived at the Manor House in Claughton with a view over Canada Works and the rest of Birkenhead. The Grand Trunk Railway in Canada owed a lot to this part of Britain. Canada Works, you can see at the top, the Chester Railway Station and other smaller stations designed by Francis Thompson along the North Wales Railway, as well as two important bridges, tubular iron bridges designed by the great railway engineer Robert Stevenson at Conway and across the Menai Strait to Anglesey. When Scott arrived in Canada, and we don't know the exact year, but he was there by early 1856 when he entered a competition for the Quebec Customs House. And his design here was a very Italianate architecture, complete with an imposing clock tower. He didn't win this competition, but he remembered his ideas from this design. A very similar building went up a few years later in Montreal, designed by a fellow architect from Liverpool who'd emigrated to Montreal about the same time. John William Hopkins designed the Royal Insurance Company building on the waterfront in Montreal, which later became the Customs House and today is the site of the Pointe à la Calière Archaeological Museum. I like to think that Hopkins and Scott were friends and may have shared their architectural ideas. But Scott's reason for coming to Canada was to work on the Grand Trunk Railway. And between Montreal and Toronto, over 30 of these standard railway stations were built using this round arch style, the Rundbogenstil, mostly in stone, though there were a few in brick. And Harold Kalman, in his Encyclopedia of Architecture, attributed these buildings to Scott, but in fact they were designed by Francis Thompson with Scott as his assistant. I wrote a paper about Thompson back in 2006, which was published in Canadian Rail magazine, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Grand Trunk Railway and the building of these stations. But when Thompson left to go back to Britain in 1859, Scott took over as the senior architect at the Grand Trunk, and he was responsible for the building of a further series of stations, about 8 of these pattern stations between Quebec City and Rivière-du-Loup. These ones survive, others have been lost. The northernmost one at Rivière-du-Loup is shown, part of it bottom right, and in the distance you can see the locomotive engine shed. Thompson designed those engine sheds but clearly these Quebec stations were not Thompson's style, no round arches, and in fact, they owe their origin really to a Quebec vernacular architecture, best illustrated by the birthplace of Sir George Etienne Cartier, top center, with that ski jump roof design. The big project in Montreal for the Grand Trunk was building the Victoria Bridge, then the world's longest bridge across the St. Lawrence River, with cast iron tubes. The piers, the stonework, the arch at the entrance to this bridge were all designed by Francis Thompson. But we do know, and both Thompson and Robert Stevenson, who designed the Victoria Bridge, had also designed the Britannia Bridge in North Wales. And here you see one of its iron tubes being lifted into place between the high towers. Scott appears in a group photograph of the engineers and architects and managers for the bridge project. Scott is in the back row with the bushy hair, and sitting in the center is James Hodges, who was the project engineer and the contractor's representative in Canada. Also, I mention here Alexander Mackenzie Ross, who was the chief engineer of the Grand Trunk Railway. This picture is interesting, top left, because it's very similar in composition to the painting at the bottom right, which had been done 9 years earlier, featuring Robert Stevenson and his design group for the Britannia Bridge, which you can see drawn in the background of this photograph. And I think that Hodges probably planned this photographic group to be reminiscent of the earlier group. And the engineer that I just mentioned, Alexander Mackenzie Ross, was in fact a member of both teams. He worked on both the Britannia Bridge and the Victoria Bridge. Scott went on to do other work for the Grand Trunk Railway, particularly designing railway workers' housing around the large workshops, passenger station, and railway yards at Point St. Charles in Montreal. An example of these buildings can still be seen in Kingston. This row of railway workers' houses was actually designed by Francis Thompson, and it is heritage designated, still there today. But the houses that Scott designed in Point St. Charles would have been quite similar. This is how Scott looked at age 39 in private practice in Montreal, though there was some overlap between his work for the Grand Trunk and his private practice, but he became an establishment architect for about 15 years, designing churches, schools, houses, and even mansions in the Golden Mile in Montreal. But beyond Montreal, he also did work all along the Grand Trunk Railway in other towns that were served by the railway, both in Ontario and Quebec. One project for which he did the drawing that you see top left was the waterworks in Hamilton, designed by the engineer Thomas Coltrane Kiefer. Now, Kiefer wasn't an architect, so it appears from this drawing that he employed Scott on this project. We don't know exactly what Scott's role was, but clearly you can see some of the features of this building, particularly the repeated round arches, which were characteristic of a lot of the earlier work. But his Gothic experience, particularly from visiting Germany in 1850, paid off when he got the responsibility to build Christ Church Cathedral in Montreal. The old cathedral had burned down in 1856, and a new cathedral designed by the architect Frank Wills, who's famous for his cathedral, also High Gothic, in Fredericton, New Brunswick. But Wills died just as construction was starting, and so Scott took over the project. He also, soon after, designed St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church nearby in Montreal, also in a High Gothic style. Wills had not done the drawings required to build the church. So the drawings that are held in the Christ Church Cathedral archives in Montreal are actually by Thomas Seaton Scott. Here's the ground plan, an elevation, end elevations, and a section. And you can see the high quality of these watercolor drawings, but his watercolors in his 1850 sketchbooks indicated that he was already skilled, a skilled artist for this type of work. Other buildings that he designed included the one you can see on the left with the round arches, a school in Montreal, but the architectural style of some other school and university buildings in Montreal, although it incorporated the Italianate, it was moving to the Second Empire style, and some of the architects involved in these Montreal projects were people who had worked for Scott. Alexander Hutchison, a prominent Montreal architect, had actually started as a stonecutter on the Christ Church Cathedral project under Scott. But having completed those two large churches in Montreal, Scott moved on to design many smaller churches across Ontario and Quebec. Many of them survive and are local landmarks, in some cases National Historic Sites. In Ontario, we have Trinity Church, Cornwall, St. John Prescott, and I already mentioned St. Bartholomew's in New Edinburgh. Here's a picture of Trinity Church in Cornwall as it originally appeared in 1858, so only a year after Scott had started on the Christ Church Cathedral project in Montreal. And as it looks today, it has lost its tall steeple, but the other Gothic features are still very evident. St. Bartholomew's is interesting. Personally, for me, Catherine mentioned that I had previously spoken to Heritage Ottawa about Thomas Seaton Scott nearly 20 years ago, and that talk was given in St. Bartholomew's Church in New Edinburgh, not in the church hall, but actually in the church itself. The church has the sketch that you see bottom right, drawn by Scott, which envisaged more ornamentation, particularly along the roof line with those two spires at each end. But as this contemporary article says, a lot of the architectural ornamentation had to be left out for cost reasons. This church was being built in a village which had only 15 Anglican families, so it was mainly being built for the use of the Governor General, and the land was donated by the heirs of Thomas Mackay, but still it was a costly project. But this is Thomas Seaton Scott's first work in the capital. Family matters. Scott married Mary Mackenzie in 1859. Here they are in 1870, photographed by Notman. And Mary was the sister of William Mackenzie, who was the locomotive manager at the Grand Trunk Railway, a very responsible position. Another of her brothers was a railway station architect in England working for Sir William Tite, who was with Francis Seaton Scott, one of the two greatest early Victorian railway station architects. They were all the nephews and niece of another William Mackenzie, who was one of Europe's greatest railway contractors, an early partner of Thomas Brassey, who built railways all over France and even in Russia. That William Mackenzie had no children of his own, so he aided the careers of his nephews, all of whom did very well. Thomas and Mary had 4 children who also did well. Seaton became a mechanical engineer in New York City, Thomas a civil engineer in Toronto, Alice married Henry Turner in Ottawa, and Gordon became chief clerk for the Grand Trunk Railway in Ottawa. But Scott made the move after 15 years in Montreal into government. He must have had good contacts, and these are potential ones. Sir George Etienne Cartier, who was Minister of Defense and leader of the Tory party in Quebec, was actually the legal counsel to the Grand Trunk Railway. Sir Francis Hincks had founded the Grand Trunk Railway in 1852 and would have become its president, but instead became the Minister of Finance. And Hector Louis Langevin, who was a close associate of Cartier, was the Minister of Public Works. Apart from politicians, Scott probably knew Charles John Bridges, a very influential railway manager in Britain and in southwestern Ontario, who had become managing director of the Grand Trunk Railway in Montreal, but had moved to Ottawa in 1868 to be Commissioner of Canadian Government Railways, including the Intercolonial Railway. His office was actually in the West Block of Parliament, the same building as the Department of Public Works. So possibly with those people as references, Scott was appointed as the sole architect at the Department of Public Works. This cabinet memo signed by Georges Etienne Cartier says, it talks of the necessity exists for an officer having special attainments to oversee the several architectural works authorized by the Government of Canada and to control and regulate the progress and expenditure upon such works. Thomas Seaton Scott of Montreal, architect, whose age was 44 years and on last birthday, and who is possessed of special attainments in his profession, the said Thomas Seaton Scott to be appointed to the office and position of architect in the Department of Public Works of Canada. A year later, another memo signed by Charles Tupper is the cabinet decision to promote Thomas Seaton Scott to be chief architect of the department. He was in the process of organizing and expanding the chief architect's branch. But the other side of the page on the right was the request for medical leave in 1881, which led to his retirement altogether from public works. But while he was there, one of the biggest tasks was to complete the parliamentary library. The portion of the library in the red triangle on the left had not been completed in 1865 with the rest of the Parliament buildings. So it was Scott's team which completed the building. And we know the names of 3 of his subordinates who did various parts of the work on the library, John Bowes, Fred Alexander, and J.W.H. Watts, who did this sketch on the right of the interior arrangement of the library. But all this work was directed by Scott, as was the landscaping of Parliament Hill itself, based on the design by Calvert Vaux, the New York landscape architect. But Scott actually visited New York in order to work there with Vaux and bring his plans back to Ottawa. The wall around Parliament Hill was also completed under Scott's direction, but designed by his subordinate Fred Alexander. Finally, the pavilion overlooking the Ottawa River at the back of Parliament Hill is attributed to Scott, though the pavilion which is there today is a 1995 replica built as the police memorial. During Scott's 10 years in public works, the Second Empire style became known as the Dominion style for government buildings. One of the earliest in 1871 was the Toronto Post Office, designed by Henry Langley. Scott may not have influenced this choice, but you can see the combination of the Italianate architecture of the 3 floors of the building combined with the mansard roof, which made it Second Empire. The Montreal Post Office, top right, was a federal building in the Second Empire style. And below on the left, we have the Customs House in St. John, New Brunswick. Scott directed this project very closely, corresponding with the local architects, McKean and Fairweather in New Brunswick. The last building I show was part of this Second Empire trend in Montreal, the Grand City Hall, designed by Alexander Hutchison, again a former employee of Thomas Seaton Scott and Henri Perrot. The finest Second Empire building in Ottawa was certainly the post office, designed by Walter Chesterton. And again, this was a public works commission under Scott's direction. Chesterton had been the assistant to William T. Thomas at Lisgar Collegiate and St. Andrew's Church, but he was a very talented architect and artist in his own right. Unfortunately, we lost this building. The attic was destroyed by fire in 1904, and although the building was rebuilt with an extra story, it was demolished in 1938 to make way for the War Memorial. Scott's own house at 478 Albert Street, where he lived while working at Public Works and in retirement, later became the Albert House Inn. Today it's an ordinary residence. It is heritage designated, but it's very similar to other buildings across Canada built under Scott's direction. The Malahat Customs House in Victoria, BC, for example, is a National Historic Site that's attributed to Scott. The James Major House on the Golden Mile in Montreal, bottom left, and other government buildings built in a simplified Second Empire style, but clearly Scott's house, which he's believed to have designed himself, fits into this pattern. Scott maintained his position at Public Works through several changes of government. The Liberals took power in 1873, and Alexander Mackenzie, the new Prime Minister, became Minister of Public Works, so Scott's boss, and he was formerly a stonemason and a building contractor. So my feeling is that he respected Scott for the value of his work rather than any political considerations, and the chief architect position was not treated as a patronage post. Scott was able to expand his staff. He hired many architects whose names became well known later: Fred Alexander, David Ewart, who later became chief architect, J.P.M. LaCourte, Lawrence Fennings Taylor, J.W.H. Watts, Bradish Billings, and Henry James, to a total of 20, hired originally as clerks or draftsmen, but they basically learned their trade in Public Works through what was in fact a very long apprenticeship before they could be classified as architects. The Tories and Hector Langevin returned to power in 1878, and Scott continued under Langevin until 1881, when he retired due to ill health. But before he retired, he was able to complete this probably grandest project, the Mackenzie Tower, on the West Block of Parliament and the west wing of the West Block. The original building was designed by Thomas Stent and Augustus Laver, the English architects who had won the 1859 design competition, but the tower was Scott's design. Scott also is credited with the design of the drill hall on the driveway. It was really the first of its kind built by Public Works, and it became the model for the Hamilton Drill Hall, built a few years later by Scott's subordinate Henry James. But most of the later drill halls were built in a different crenellated style, either by Scott's successor, Thomas Fuller, or later by the Department of Militia rather than the Department of Public Works. Scott also supervised the fortifications at Quebec, including the Kent Gate and the St. Louis Gate. The drawings for these were done by Scott's staff, including the same draftsman, J.W.H. Watts, who I mentioned earlier. And it's interesting that they were built by the prominent railway contractor Horace Beamer, who then came to Ottawa and built the stonework for the Prince of Wales Bridge, today's Chief William Commander Bridge, and later built the Alexandra Bridge across the Ottawa River, as well as the Ottawa and Gatineau Railway. So just a curious link. Another venture was the National Gallery of Canada. Scott, as an architect, was one of 5 members of the Committee of Management of the Royal Canadian Academy. He's shown here in 1880 with Henry Sandham, who worked with William Notman, providing artwork for the backgrounds of Notman's group portraits. James Griffiths, a painter, Robert Harris, the portrait artist who did the Fathers of Confederation, the famous group painting, and Napoleon Bourassa, who specialized in church interior decoration. These men pulled together the first national art exhibition in Canada in 1880. Scott remained on the council of the Royal Canadian Academy until his death. So for the first national exhibition in 1880, Scott submitted as a diploma work, which was required by the Academy, the 1873 Toronto Union Station. And you can see that this building, it did have round arch windows. They're a bit small because it was a very long building, but it also had an imposing Italianate clock tower, quite reminiscent of the tower from his 1856 drawing for the Quebec Customs House. But he withdrew this drawing and substituted perhaps what he considered a better work, or maybe there were other reasons, the West Block Tower, and his watercolor is now held by the National Gallery of Canada as his RCA diploma work. Alexander Mackenzie, the Prime Minister, actually had his office in this tower, as more recently did Justin Trudeau. The first art exhibition, the founding of the National Gallery, was in the former Clarendon Hotel at the corner of Sussex and George Street in Ottawa. And immediately after that exhibition, Scott redesigned the oldest part of the Clarendon to make a 3-story stone building on Sussex that matched the existing stone wing along George Street. But that building became Canada's first national museum in 1882, the Geological Museum and the home of the Geological Survey of Canada, while the gallery moved to another building on Bank Street. You see it top right. This was originally the workshops building erected by Thomas Seaton Scott as an automated machine shop to build furniture for the Library of Parliament. When that task was complete, he transformed it to house the Supreme Court in the north part of the building and the National Gallery in the near wing to us. The gallery was only there for 6 years because an expanding Supreme Court forced them out. So again, another building had to be adapted, and the chosen building was the former Orange Hall at the corner of O'Connor and Queen, and the ground floor there was the fisheries exhibit. But what Scott did was to combine the upper 2 floors inside to create a 2-story high exhibition room reaching up into the attic space. And that's where the National Gallery remained until 1912, when it moved to the Victoria Museum. Curiously, the first 3 curators of the gallery were all Scott employees: J.W.H. Watts, Lawrence Fennings Taylor, and Bradish Billings. Another Scott building of note was the Mackenzie building at the Royal Military College, Kingston. It's again in a Second Empire style, but it's lost most of the round arch windows. They're mostly rectangular, but very similar in style to the Quebec National Assembly, built 3 years later. And I wondered about this similarity, but the 3 architects of the Assembly included Pierre Gauvreau, who was the architect for the province of Quebec, but he had previously worked closely with Thomas Seaton Scott at the Grand Trunk Railway in 1858 on the building of those 8 railway stations between Quebec and Rivière-du-Loup. So just another interesting coincidence or architectural link. Out west, these buildings in Manitoba were constructed under Scott's direction, but the project architect was JPM Lacourte. He'd come from Quebec City to Public Works and moved out to Winnipeg to supervise the construction of the government house, the legislature, the courthouse, and jail, again in the Second Empire or Dominion style. But Scott retired, as I said, for health reasons. We don't know specifically what his health problem was in 1881. And Notman photographed him in 1886. He still looks like a distinguished gentleman. I think that's his wife in the bottom corner. I can't be certain. But his successor at Public Works was Thomas Fuller, who'd originally designed the center block and then gone to work in the United States, but came back to succeed Thomas Seaton Scott in 1881. And of course, in Ottawa, Fuller is best known from that period for the Langevin block, today the PMO PCO office, in the very much the round arch style again, with a mansard roof, kind of transitioning into the Queen Anne style, but a very imposing sandstone building that is highly reminiscent of the Customs House built 7 years earlier under Scott's direction in St. John, which I mentioned earlier. And I just think it's curious when you look at these two buildings side by side, you can think about, well, was it in fact a holdover from Scott's support for the Dominion style, which led to the design of the Langevin block, when most of Fuller's other work was rather different. But Scott wasn't quite finished. He designed a railway station in Winnipeg for the Canadian Pacific Railway, possibly while he was still at Public Works, because this station was erected by the government and handed over to the CPR. It was designed by Scott, but unfortunately damaged in a fire in 1886, and the rebuilt structure looked rather different. But the picture top right is the way Scott designed it. And there were other railway buildings reminiscent of early Grand Trunk architecture that surrounded it. The interior was also quite interesting. This is the dining room. It was necessary here for large numbers of railway passengers to be fed quickly because in those days there were no dining cars on the trains. This was the largest railway station in Western Canada until CPR built a new station in Vancouver in 1897. Scott's last major project was Bonaventure Station for the Grand Trunk in New York. An early sketch of it, top right, shows a clock tower, again very similar to Scott's earlier work, but without the Italianate dome. And it, as you can see from the bottom right picture, the station as finished with the round arch windows and the mansard roof had really followed the same Dominion style that Scott had promoted for his 10 years at Public Works. It's interesting that the Grand Trunk had another building, their headquarters at Point St. Charles, built in a very similar style in 1875. It's not clear who the architect was of that building, but it does suggest that the style that Scott was using was still considered a standard by the Grand Trunk Railway, and in fact harkens back to the railway style in Britain. And here's a photograph of the Grand Trunk Bonaventure Station as completed. Unfortunately, the roof was lost to a major fire, and eventually the entire building was demolished. But the interior was spectacular. This two-story waiting room at the entrance, and this very elegant dining room and bar. Now, just considering Scott's career, there's not much written about him. Margaret Archibald wrote a history of the Department of Public Works, but only started in 1881, so missed Scott's time there, but did mention his contribution as the first chief architect, organizing the department, a memo that he wrote describing that organization, hiring and training subordinates, and developing the process of public design. The other papers by Dana Johnson and Janet Wright were rather critical. Dana Johnson wrote in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography a highly critical article claiming that neither professional standing nor any other known connection explained Scott's appointment to Public Works, that he was neither an active practicing architect, well, he was, nor a major influence in setting federal design policy, well, I think he did. Scott showed no particular grasp of new architectural currents, though he was certainly comfortable in more than one architectural style. His accomplishments, largely bureaucratic, overshadowed by his successor, lived in near obscurity until his death, served without distinction on the Royal Canadian Academy Council. So not very complimentary. And Janet Wright in 1982, writing the Thomas Seaton Scott, the architect versus the administrator, again dismissed most of his career as administrative in nature, with the one exception being the Mackenzie Tower. And I guess she could hardly ignore that beautiful drawing in the National Gallery, which he had submitted as his RCA diploma work. Wrapping up, my assessment of Thomas Seaton Scott is that he definitely created and organized the Chief Architect's branch at Public Works. His entire career output was influenced by his early studies in Britain and on his grand tour in Italy and Germany. He definitely guided the Dominion style for the 10 years that it was a standard in Ottawa. That's evidenced by the fact that his subordinates didn't actually continue in that style, but they branched out in their own directions after they left Public Works. And I do believe that the National Gallery of Canada is part of his legacy in several ways. And fortunately, a number of his works are still prominent across the country and in Ottawa. His resting place is in Mount Royal Cemetery, a rather unassuming gravestone. I found it while tracking down the graves of other architects, engineers, and managers of the Grand Trunk Railway. He was buried in Montreal because his wife wanted the grave to be next to her brother and her sister-in-law, who had died much earlier, and they are there in on that other monument with the broken column beside it. One of their children was also buried here later. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you found it interesting, and I would certainly be glad to answer some questions at this point.
Thank you, David, for your insightful presentation. You managed to pack a lot of information in a very short period of time. And thank you for agreeing to take a few questions. Members of our audience are now invited to pose them of our speaker. As Catherine mentioned, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat box, which appears at the bottom of your screen. I'll moderate the questions and comments for repetition and length. We have one question in already, and this is quite an interesting one. Did you come across any interesting stories on the interaction between Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie and Thomas Scott on Mackenzie's request to add a secret staircase in the West Block Mackenzie Tower?
Yeah, the secret staircase is interesting. The doorway that leads to the outside on the west face of the West Block is still there, but it's tucked around the corner beside the main door and a little hard to see. But yes, there was a little spiral staircase embedded in the wall that went straight up to the Prime Minister's office. And I believe that Justin Trudeau is known to have used it at least once. But I don't know whether it was put in at Mackenzie's request. I do know that for a time, Mackenzie occupied a house just across the other side of Bank Street in what was originally Colonel Bye's Upper Town. There were a number of impressive homes and mansions on the top part of Bank Street and Victoria Street. And Alexander Mackenzie, for a time while he was Prime Minister, actually lived there and also lived on Wellington Street. So having a convenient little doorway under his office would have been a nice feature for him.
Thanks, David. Can you tell us a little more about the 1850 sketchbooks and their significance?
Well, yes, I was lucky to be able to see them. I don't know exactly how it happened, but they came into the possession of another architect, John Albert Ewart, many years later, who, after Scott's death, In fact, Ewart graduated from the University of Toronto the same year that Scott died, so they never knew each other. But Ewart, John Albert Ewart, was the son of David Ewart, who was one of the first draftsmen that Scott hired into the department. So I suspect that somehow his sketchbooks passed on to David Ewart, who passed them to his son, who donated them to Library and Archives. They're beautiful books. They're fragile. I wasn't allowed to touch them. I had to have an archivist sitting beside me turning the pages, and she was blown away by the quality of the artwork, particularly because she had just read Dana Johnson's and Janet Wright's articles, which claimed that Scott was not an artist or a designer. And when you look at those sketchbooks, they're just beautiful. And I wish I could have spent more time with them. I do need to go back to them sometime. And the collection is not complete. A few sketchbooks are missing.
And where did you say the collection was again?
They're held in the at Library and Archives Canada.
Okay.
So they're manuscripts. I think because they're drawings, they were part of the special collection that you could only look at in a different reading room. There was a special reading room in the west end of the building. And so where they may be part of the National Map Collection or the drawings collection anyway, rather than the regular archives.
Okay, thank you. What are your views on the redevelopment of the West Block as the new House of Commons? Is it respectful of the original West Block design?
Well, I used to go to the West Block often for budget lockups in room 200, which was the grand ballroom in the North Wing. And that room is no longer, but in fact, it was not one of Scott's creations. So the fact that it was lost in the recent renovations doesn't bother me too much. I also used to eat in the cafeteria in the courtyard, which was a dismal place. So I think that transforming the courtyard into the House of Commons is beautiful, taking advantage of the fact that the West Block has fine stonework and ornamental windows on the inside walls as well as the outside walls. So it was a unique opportunity to create a very special space for the House of Commons.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've mentioned some of the rather negative articles about Scott, and yet you've conveyed a very positive interpretation. How do you explain the articles on his legacy and why your interpretation is so different?
Well, first of all, I come at this from an interest in railway architecture, and the work of railway architects is largely undocumented. The normal sources that architectural historians go to have very little about railways. But in fact, there was an entirely separate study of railway architecture done by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board when a private member's bill called the Heritage Railway Stations Protection Act was passed. So there was a large body of documentation on railway station architecture and architects, which was created by Parks Canada, and that hasn't really been used as a resource by the people who write up architectural history. They were mainly relying on published sources or government documents, which really didn't cover the internal workings of the railways.
And when was that resource created, which you're referring?
I don't remember the exact year of the Heritage Railway Stations Protection Act, but it was in the 1970s, I think. But there are railway stations designated all across Canada that are now protected under that act. Very unusual to have a private member's bill go through as heritage legislation.
Mm-hmm. Now, do any of his surviving railway stations or other buildings have heritage designations? Are we going to see him in the future?
Well, I mean, you've got several in Ottawa. The West Block and the Drill Hall are classified federal heritage buildings, so there's no question about their heritage designation. His own home has a municipal Part 4 designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. The railway stations that he is known to have designed in Quebec. Several of them are still protected under the Heritage Railway Stations Protection Act because there's still railway property along the functioning railway line that's used by both CN and Via Rail. So there are plenty of buildings that are designated, but unfortunately, the Winnipeg, Toronto, and Montreal railway stations that he designed are all long gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very unfortunate. Now, this question may come up with various architects who who supervise others. How do we know whether it was Scott or a subordinate who designed the building?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And the main answer is we don't, because Public Works did not identify which of its staff members were responsible for which projects. I did mention occasionally you get a drawing like the interior of the Library of Parliament, which was actually signed by J.W.H. Watts. But really, the direction is what's important here. When you look at architectural attributions, they are always to the partners in the architectural firms, whether or not they were the designers. If your firm designed a building, you own it. And that's fair because you really can't tell how much direction the principal of an architectural firm or the chief architect of Public Works gave to his subordinates. So I'm really relying more on what Scott did in private practice and how that carried forward and backwards to what was done under his tenure at Public Works.
Okay, thank you. Now it sounds as if you're being asked to vacate your room right now. Is that correct? Or
yeah, the cleaning staff are getting a bit antsy. It's 8 o'clock, and I think they're going to go off duty. I had to find a quiet spot here. I will tell you, I'm at Trinity College celebrating the 70th anniversary of the chapel, which was designed by another Scott, Giles Gilbert Scott, who designed the Trinity Chapel here in 1955 and was also a prominent British Gothic architect, but no relation to Thomas Seaton Scott whatsoever.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. We're going to have to wrap things up now. So if you have additional questions, please email them to Heritage Ottawa at info@heritageottawa.org, and we'll share them with our speaker. I would like to thank David once again for his presentation. Before we end this event, our December lecture will be presented in person at Beechwood Cemetery. Our speaker will be Dr. Sarah Gelbart, who will make the case for brutalist architecture, which I'm sure will be of interest to many people. The lecture will be followed by refreshments. This event is free and open to all, but please register via our website at heritageottawa.org. Next, Heritage Ottawa will present its second annual online auction between March 8th and 14th, 2026. Everyone is invited to bid on a variety of items ranging in price from $30 to several thousand. These include tickets and experiences from the Stratford Festival, hotel stays, restaurant meals, spa days, and various sought-after books, including an original volume of Bartlett prints. There really is something for everyone. If you have any items you wish to donate, please email us at auction@heritageottawa.org. Finally, as mentioned earlier this evening, Heritage Ottawa lectures are provided free of charge. We encourage you to join Heritage Ottawa if you are not yet a member, and to donate to the organization to help continue to share heritage stories. Information is available on the Heritage Ottawa website. And with that, thank you for joining us, and good night.